And here we are getting into our second module or our second unit, depending on what you want to call it. It's really the same thing, and it's the Anthropology unit module. And so what I've done is I've given you, or I've created this Prezi, which is the Intro to Anthropology, and it basically covers everything. It's a really, really long lecture. There's a lot of information here, so try to bear with me. There's quite a bit. I'll try to fly through it as quickly as I can. I'll post the Prezi for you. You can, by all means, take your time, go through it, process it at your own speed, but I'm going to kind of walk you through it and show you what anthropology is all about in a nutshell. So, anthropology really is more than just evolution and what makes humans human. Yes, that is a significant part of it, but it's not exactly what a lot of people think. It's it's not about digging up fossils or human skeletons. It's not just about looking at apes and saying, well, we're like apes. We eat bananas. They eat bananas. We must be the same. That's part of it, and I've oversimplified it, but that's just one small part of it. So anthropology has subcategories or subfields. You'll see here physical anthropology, archaeology, linguistics, and cultural anthropology. And it's amazing because if you look at each of these fields of study that you see here, physical archaeology, linguistics, cultural anthropology, and you could literally spend an entire course studying these. In fact, people will often go to university and study just one of these topics or one of these subfields in anthropology. And they're so vast and so intricate that it's almost a shame to simplify it and oversimplify it, where it's all just about primates. And again, the course that we're in, that I'm teaching, doesn't do it justice, and I'll tell you, it doesn't do it justice. But what we try to do is skim the surface and cover a little bit of it, just to kind of give you a feel for what it's all about. You know, interestingly enough, the subfields are themselves very interesting, because when you look at archaeology, archaeology is a part of anthropology. So the people who are out there with their little brushes and their entire grids that have been laid out over an area, and they literally will map out grids with string. If you haven't seen how archaeologists do it, they're very meticulous with their little brushes, and they don't want to disturb everything so much that they kind of move things around, but they do want to dig things up so that they can see what was there, but they also want to see how it was laid out, right? Because to an archaeologist, it's not so much what they find, but what the position they found it in and was, and why that's important to them. Well, they could deduct quite a bit based on how they find things. If you've heard of a place in Italy called Vesuvius, where the volcano erupted, and people were left, literally they were caught by this volcano to the point where their ashes, and they were encased in ashes, and they died almost instantaneously, and they were frozen in the ashes. And so when archaeologists kind of found them, they literally found them in their final positions, some of them in terror, some of them holding young children. Quite creepy, when you think about it as an archaeologist, that people died thousands, in the case hundreds of years ago. Well, not, this hasn't been found recently, but when they had found them, they'd been found hundreds of centuries prior to, and so digging these things up and trying to kind of come up with the reasons for this, and to see this firsthand is quite fascinating. And so archaeologists study ancient civilizations. That's what they do. If you're looking at paleontologists, they study prehistoric, right? Archaeologists will study the ancient world. Physical anthropologists are the ones who will study the physical world as it stands now. Cultural anthropologists study cultures around the world, living cultures, dead cultures. There are countless fields. So physical anthropology is all about human biology. Now, what's amazing about physical anthropology is that when you watch that BBC video, Born to Survive, they talk all about humans as a biological species. And the guy who's presenting it is pretty comical, actually. but he presents it in such a way that he compares us to other animals, compares us as a species to other species, and shows how we've evolved as a biological species and how we've evolved in such a way that we are who we are today. I don't want to give away too much, but I will say that what's really, really fascinating is that evolution, and I have mentioned this before, I'll continue to mention this, evolution has little to do with the best. Evolution is sometimes luck, sometimes a species' ability to adapt. And adaptation doesn't mean the best. Sometimes it could mean, the biggest chicken. And when I say chicken, I don't mean like, what you go to KFC for. I'm talking about like the species that runs and hides. And what's amazing, if the species that runs and hides survives, well, they're the ones that procreate. The species that stands up to whatever and dies, well, they're effectively wiped out. And so the rest of the species that is perpetuated or that continues on are, in fact, the ones that run and hide. Well, what does that tell us about the species in the future? Well, they're the ones that evolved, and they're the ones that adapted because they ran and hid. Does that make them the best? No. Does it make them the strongest? Not necessarily. Does it make them the fastest? Maybe. Does it make them the most fearful? Perhaps. But they're the ones that made it. And so when you think of evolution, don't think of bigger, faster, stronger, better. No, sometimes it's quite the opposite. So physical anthropology, and you see here, is all about understanding human variation, right? And what's really interesting is that if you look at humans around the world, there are variations, whether it be the way we look physically, our abilities physically, our language. Well, I guess that would be linguistics, but and that's kind of like an offshoot, but we'll talk about that later. So how is it that we're unique? How is it that we're different? We've evolved in different parts of the world. Our physical being or our physical makeup has adapted to the areas in which we live. And so, what are the subfields of physical anthropology? Well, the study of fossils, obviously DNA analysis, which is becoming a big thing because if you consider that the human genome really hasn't been, as understood in the past as it is today, I would say that since the mapping of the human genome or our DNA, we've been able to advance, years, leaps and bounds beyond what our ancestors or, in fact, people, 30 or 40 years ago would know compared to what we know today in DNA analysis. In fact, you can watch on TV where they'll say, yeah, send us a sample of your DNA and we'll tell you where you're from. Oh, I always thought I was German, but I'm really Scottish, or that kind of thing. That's an integral part of physical anthropology, documenting and explaining our differences in how we can tolerate heat or how some of us are more prone to diseases than others. And if you don't know anything about certain diseases, they are specifically, I'm not going to say targeting because it's not like the disease goes, that group of people. No, but there are certain groups and physically they are just not capable of handling certain diseases the way others are. And that's just a part of our anthropology. That's physical anthropology. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, there's something called thalassemia. You want to look that one up. It's very interesting. It's THALASS. Let me see. Let me check. TH. Let me just Google it because hey. Thalassemia. There it is. And it's very interesting because if you look at thalassemia, there's a double S in there. But if you look up thalassemia, it's very unique. It's an inherited disorder that specifically targets, well, not targets, but is found primarily in certain groups of people. Very interesting. You should look it up. I'm not going to go into it too much because I want to get back to the lecture. But if you are interested, check it out. It's just one of those things where I was saying to you that there are just certain diseases that are more prevalent in certain groups than others, and that's part of the reason of population genetics. Physical anthropology also has a great deal to do with the way we appear, right? And again, our ancestors, well, yeah, there we go. And it has a lot to do with studying our nearest relatives, right? Now, it's not necessarily that we study certain apes and say, ah, yes, well, this group of apes is clearly connected to this race of people. Far from it. That's primatology, and that doesn't really necessarily talk about, some people are chimps while other people are baboons. That's not what it is at all. It's just a simple study of primates as a relation to us. Now, if you don't know anything, and I know I'm kind of jumping around all over the place because I'm trying to incorporate a whole bunch of stuff in here, but really what it all comes down to is your what physical anthropologists try to do is they try to find connections. And I think as a species, we as human beings are very unique and yet not. I mean, if you look at us as a species, you say we really are just not good. We're not. I mean, consider a lot of things that we have. We from the point of birth, we're useless. For the first few years of our lives, we are completely useless. We would be open to predators. I mean, if you know a newborn, you see a newborn, all they do is cry. I mean, if there's a predator out there hunting babies, human babies would be tops on their list, right? And so it's just an instinct that we have that keeps us alive, but it's not the instinct of being able to fight off. I mean, we have no claws, we have no teeth, we have no speed, we have no real strength. Most other animals in the wild, strip us down, lock us in a cage with even a chimpanzee, and an angry chimpanzee could kill a person, right? We're not built for that. And then you say, or someone could argue, yeah, but our brains are just that much better. They are. But that's a period of evolution that took place to allow our brains to develop that way. But I would argue, and other people have argued, that yeah, maybe our brains have evolved, but perhaps we've evolved so far that we've actually evolved into weakness. I mean, many people, the average person doesn't know how to start a fire. I mean, think about it. Without real tools or a lighter or matches, we'd have a really, really hard time starting a fire, let alone creating a tool. Later on, you'll see, and I'll show you, there's a really awesome video out there where people say, our earliest ancestors made stone tools. And you're like, well, yeah, stone tools. You pick up a sharp rock, attach it to a spear, and use it as a weapon. Yeah, I guess it's as simple as that. But try to find the right rock. Try to find the right rock that you can, break into a sharp edge, because, a blunt rock on the end of a stick really is nothing. But again, you would have to be able to find these things. And we're just not that capable. I mean, physically, we're not built for the environment. We need clothes to stay warm, right? In the case of certain climates. Other climates, we can't handle the heat. We need to stay out of the heat. We're not very good. Our night vision is god awful. Our sense of smell is pretty bad. So really, most other animals are way better than us. And if we don't have our modern tools, we really are useless. And so how is it that we are similar yet different? And that's where physical anthropologists are really working to see, well, what makes us us? How is it that we are here? One of the things that I've kind of spoken about in the past, and I'll talk to you about it. If you remember hearing or seeing a few years ago, there was a guy who basically was the only person to skydive from the stratosphere or the upper atmosphere or space. He literally went up into space in this hot air balloon, and he fell out of the hot air balloon and plummeted towards Earth, and then opened up the parachute and landed, and he successfully did this, and it was like a whole big thing on Red Bull. Anyway, what was amazing is the ascent, whereas the balloon is going up, and this guy's in like a full-on spacesuit. And it's amazing because as he's going up, the people are talking and they're saying, at this point he's X number of feet above sea level. Humans can't survive because there's a lack of oxygen. And you're like, wow, that's actually pretty true. I mean, we can't survive at certain altitudes because we can't breathe. It becomes almost difficult, impossible for us to breathe. Okay, so we can't go very high, all right? Well, we can't really go to the further depths either because pressure will crush us. So we can't really swim that deeply because you go into the ocean, you can actually dive so far, but eventually, the pressure will get to you, all right? So we can't go too high, we can't go too low. We literally have to stay on the middle ground. And of that middle ground, which is, the earth that we live on, we can only survive certain climates without other tools or without other accoutrements or things that will keep us safe and warm and dry, etc., etc., etc. So really, we are an anomaly of a species. We don't really fit anywhere, and yet we're fitting everywhere. How is that possible? And that's what physical anthropologists are really working towards, trying to figure out how is that? Why is that? Anthropologists are also fascinated by this whole idea of evolution. And this is the little joke that you see here of and this is the common image, by the way, of evolution. And for most people, not Homer, but that whole idea of ape transforming, getting bigger, bigger, and turning into a human. And what's really fascinating is the whole idea of growth. Now, amazingly enough, if you consider evolution and say to yourself, so as we evolve, we get bigger. But why? Why do we get bigger? If you look at, for example, ancient or Ice Age creatures that are around today, so they lived back in the Ice Age, the last major Ice Age, and that are alive today, you will see, in fact, that they have gotten smaller. Their evolution has actually gone this way, not this way. And so the idea that we have started as a chimp and worked our way up to this seems quite absurd if you consider evolution and the principles of evolution. And so what physical anthropologists are doing is, in fact, they're starting to reevaluate the theory of evolution. And that's, I think, a very good thing, because for the longest time, a lot of people have been told something that really may or may not be true. And the fact that physical anthropologists are constantly re-examining this is a thing that keeps us aware and makes us just that much more intelligent. At least that's my take on it. So one thing you'll want to know is evolution is a process and not a thing. It takes time. It's one of the things that happens, and I mentioned this before. It's evolving and perpetuating the species, and for that to happen, these three independent facts are, as they're known, take place. One is replication. Is that, and I mentioned this before, you have to be able to procreate. You have to have offspring, and your offspring have to have offspring, and so forth and so forth and so forth, because that's what allows your species to continue on. That's an important part of evolution. Another part is variation, that each of the offspring is slightly different from its parents and its siblings. And again, that's a good thing. And the reason why this is a good thing is as follows, and I'll explain it to you this way. If everyone was a clone, for example, if there was one original person, like if you consider the idea of Adam and Eve, right? And let's just say Adam was the first man. Now, whether you believe it or not, that's irrelevant. Let's just say there was a guy named Adam, and he was the first guy. And every person after him was a photocopy of Adam. So somebody took Adam and just copied him and made Adam's son, and then copied him and made his son, and copied him and made his son, and copied him. So all of the flaws that Adam has are being directly copied to his son, to his grandson, to his great-grandson, to his great-great-grandson, and so forth and so forth and so forth. If there is no variation, what would have killed the original Adam? will kill his great-great-great-great-grandson. Now you may say, well, yeah, if that's a mammoth, so be it. I'm not talking about a mammoth. I'm talking, let's say, Adam dies of the flu. And if Adam dies of the flu, and every other Adam after him, who's a direct copy, who's exactly like Adam, a direct copy, is then just as vulnerable to the flu as the original Adam. If there's a variation, however, his great grandson, for example, isn't a direct copy because he's just a little bit different, and therefore the flu that would have killed Adam won't kill his great grandson because his great grandson has a bit of a difference to him. His immune system is a little bit different, and therefore he's capable of dealing with certain diseases. The next part is selection. The fact that not all offspring survive are best suited for the environment. So again, the ones that do live are the ones that can handle the environment that they're living in. If in fact they can't, they don't make it. And I'll speak to my own personal history where, if you were to speak to my grandmother, who's passed away years and years ago, but she was one of 10 children, and of the 10 children that I knew about, 8 of them were actually the ones that I knew. So my grandmother and my great aunts and my great uncles, of those 10, only 8 had survived, 2 didn't make it, due to different reasons. It doesn't matter. They died as little kids or as infants. It's not a matter of there being a different time. It was years ago, and yes, they didn't have the medicine that we have today, and blah blah blah. True, but they just weren't strong enough to survive. The ones that did survive were strong enough to make it. And again, as sad as it is, and it's a loss of human life, absolutely, but the ones that made it were strong enough, were tough enough, were capable of surviving in their environment. Speciation is a very interesting thing, and I'm going to kind of branch off and talk about what this really means. And basically what it is, it's that you have it's like you start off, and I'm kind of drawing the arrow here, and I wish I could draw here. I'll figure out a way to draw in my lectures. But if you start off with a line that goes straight up, and when it breaks off at one point in one direction, it breaks off in the other point, that's where you start to see speciation. And so what that really means is that as a species moves from one environment to another, it starts to change. It starts to adapt to its new environment, and over a period of time, and I'm not saying 2 weeks later they're different, but over a prolonged period of time, these two different species evolve. And so where they might have had a common ancestor, they have evolved in different areas and have evolved so drastically that yes, they do resemble each other, but they are no longer the same. And so the idea here is that the new selective environments reshape the population. And what that means is that yes, they look the same, but they're not the same. So a horse and a zebra look the same, they're not the same, right? And so how we kind of connect the two is say that you could never breed the two. You can't breed a horse and a zebra. You couldn't have a horbra or a Z-horse, because it's just not a thing. That's called speciation. They're different. They might have had a common ancestor once upon a time, but their evolutionary paths have diverged in such a way that they're no longer the same. There's no other way I can say it. I'm pretty sure you've figured it out. Primatology is an aspect of physical anthropology where we study primates, and again, studying primates, and anthropologists will go into the jungles and study different animals, different monkeys, gorillas, baboons, chimpanzees, and go on and on and on and on. And what they do is once upon a time, they would capture them and study them, and then some of the primatologists came along and went, that's not really working, because studying an animal in captivity is not the same as studying it in its actual environment. And so primatologists kind of stopped capturing monkeys and different primates, and then they started going out, and a famous primatologist by the name of Jane Goodall is one of those people who was very much a proponent. She was very much for the idea that if you want to study primates and truly understand them. You have to study them in their own environments, in their natural habitats, and only then will you get a true appreciation for how they live, how they interact with each other, how they communicate, how they feed themselves, how they raise their children, how they act socially, how they interact with strangers, with strange species. And Goodall herself sometimes would kind of work her way in very subtly, work her way into the primatology or the primates' social circles where they would accept her, but that would take a significant period of time. Um, and though she never really became one of them, and they did accept her, they really gave her an insight as to how they behave. And that's all really what it comes down to, is primate behavior. Primatology is again all about, and I mentioned this before, observation in its natural environment. And it's not just a matter of spending a couple days, but it really was, in the case of Jane Goodall, almost a lifetime of work. And I don't know, I think she's still alive, but yeah, it really is a significant part of primatology, is studying them in their environments, in their habitats, in their most natural state. What's amazing, and what Goodall brought to the table, was the idea that when you look at behaviors, and again I kind of point to behavior because you can't you can't talk to the primates, right? You can't sit down with a primate, lay it on the couch and say, so how do you feel about this? Let's do a word association game. You can't do that. So all you can do is study how they behave, how they act, how they treat each other, how they treat strangers, how they treat their children, and so forth. And what that does is develop a pattern, and that's what primatologists do, is they see what patterns of behavior happen. So the pattern of behavior for a mother chimpanzee with her infants is blah blah blah, and we've seen this happen countless times, so we know it's a thing. There are often odd variations that happen, but then when those variations do happen, or those weird instances happen, then we try to explain them, or primatologists try to explain them. Well, why is that happening? What changed that mother's behavior towards her infant? What caused her to be, I don't know, abusive, or to kill it? These are things that a primatologist would do and say, well, our studies have shown that they always act this way. On the rare and odd occasion they act this way. Let's find out why. But it's all about behavior, because you can't talk to them. All you can do is examine how they act. There's a video here. You can watch that. I'm not going to watch the video with you, but it's very interesting, because you'll see that as primate habitats are starting to diminish, we're seeing fewer and fewer in their natural environments, and the ones that whose environments have been damaged, their patterns of behavior change. And yes, though that is a very fascinating part of primatology, it's not necessarily an accurate display. But again, if you want to consider that their environments are changing and they're adapting and acting differently, again, that's a new branch of primatology. Okay, we'll go past that. Another part of physical anthropology is paleoanthropology. Now, paleo being from the Greek for old, anthropology being the study of people, old study of people, or study of old people. Now, this is looking at the prehistoric, so we're looking at not the ancient, but before the ancient. So we're not looking at the Egyptians and the Romans and the Greeks, we're looking before them. And that's the paleoanthropology, so the old folks, older than the old folks. And it's all about digging up fossils and digging up the artifacts around them, as I mentioned really early on in the lecture, about them being found and how they're found, and how they were buried and what they were buried with. And all of these things help us to kind of shape an understanding. The thing that a lot of people have a really hard time with is that the earth changes, the earth shifts, ground moves, storms happen, whatever, over thousands and thousands of years this happens. So things move. And so even though they're buried a certain way, things get shifted around. And then you're having a really hard time trying to figure things out, because though somebody's buried here with their spear, 25 yards away, there's something else. And you're like, wow, those don't even belong in the same place. How is that possible? Um, and then it becomes a very, very tricky situation where you're trying to figure things out based on some scattered pieces of evidence. And it's really like somebody giving you a puzzle that doesn't have all the pieces to it, right? So I'm going to give you a puzzle of 2,000 pieces, and you happen to piece together part of a really good picture, but then there's a couple areas you don't really have the full border, and you've got a couple areas that look kind of similar to something, but you're not really sure how they connect. And so if you're to look at the completed puzzle that you've put together based on the few pieces that you have, you kind of come up with an idea of what the puzzle is. Well, that's what paleoanthropology is. And so yes, they have a pretty good idea, but it's a rough estimate based on the evidence that they've gathered, and that's as good as we're going to get. Paleoanthropology has been really good in helping us understand a few things. One is evolution. Based on the fossil records that we have, we've been able to kind of come up with certain types of processes like carbon dating to kind of figure out when these people were alive, and how long ago they lived, and how old they were when they died, and so forth. And it helps us to kind of get a pretty good understanding of what people might have looked like and how they might have behaved. And when I say how they might have behaved, it really is like your environment does change you physically. It really, really does. It's not really evolution, it's more like an adaptation. But for example, someone who is spending a significant part of their life hunched over, working on a computer, for example, on a laptop. You've done it where you're working on a laptop and you're kind of leaning forward, and after a couple hours you kind of sit up and you're like, oh my god, yeah, no, I've been hunched over far too long. So you kind of stretch. But you can only imagine how it would alter you physically if you had been sitting there hanging over that laptop for 7-8 hours a day for 40 years of your life. Your spine would start to curve, and then you die, which eventually happens to all species, and then you get buried in the ground, and somebody comes along 1,000 years from now and looks at that, and by no means are you the common member of the population, but it just happens that they find your specific skeleton. And so they go, wow, people, thousands of years ago all have curved spines, probably because they were all hunched over, probably because they were ducking because there was a serious bat problem. And people spent all their time hunched over because they didn't want to get bats in their hair. Whatever. I don't know. But this is how it's all about reconstruction, and that's what I'm coming up with here. The idea that people base their reconstructions on evidence that they have. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. The nice thing about paleoanthropologists is that as new evidence comes up, they go, hey, everybody, whoops, our bad. Things have changed. It's actually this now. People go, okay, fine. Geology really has a significant impact as well in paleoanthropology, because it's not so much that you study the bones, but you study the ground that they're in. It's very essential that we understand the ground that the bones are in, because geology, and that's what we're talking about here, is that paleoanthropologists have to be able to understand the geology. For example, if there was a volcanic eruption at some point, they should be able to identify that in the layer of the ground that they're digging through and say, oh, okay, well, this person died long before the volcano erupted, so we know they didn't die from the volcano because there's a layer of sediment here that sits underneath the layer of volcanic ash, or whatever the case may be. And that's an important part. You need to understand, because even the ground that someone's buried in, or they find a skeleton, can significantly impact how the skeleton decays and how the skeleton is preserved. So geology is an integral part of studying paleoanthropology. Archaeology is also a very intricate part of it. I mentioned earlier on that archaeologists are the guys who sit there with like literally a toothbrush, and they're in the middle of a field and they're trying to move an entire mound of dirt with a toothbrush. And it's all about being very careful to not disturb the ground, being very careful to note where they're finding things, to note how they're finding things, and it's very, very meticulous. It's not just going in there with a shovel and just literally heaving dirt everywhere and hoping to God you're going to get what you're going to get. It's so tedious, in fact, that sometimes a lot of people realize that it's not for them when they get into archaeology. They'll go do a field study and go, yeah, far too much patience required, not my thing. So, paleoanthropology is all about understanding our history, our line. And if you remember the image that I showed of the monkey evolving into Homer, and the question is always that if we evolved from apes, why do we still have apes? Why didn't they all evolve with us? And paleoanthropologists, the one question that they're looking to figure out is, where's that missing link? Where is that link between ape and man? If in fact we evolved from apes, at what point, where's that transformative one ape man thing, you know? And that's really the question, is that if we trace ourselves backwards, forget starting to find the starting point. Let's work from our existing point backwards. So if we could start studying skeletons and human remains back 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, 400 years, 500 years, and so forth, so forth, and so forth, at what point, if we go backwards, where was that evolutionary chain? Where was the missing link? And they've called this the missing link, and that really is like the holy grail of paleoanthropology, is finding the missing link between ape and human. Archaeology is all about, again, studying ancient societies. Paleoanthropology, as I mentioned before, is the oldest of the old. Archaeology is the study of the ancient world. And the thing about archaeology is archaeologists are a little more, they have an advantage, because societies and the periods that they're studying are far more rich. And I don't mean like gold, but far more rich in the fact that there's a lot more available. So, an archaeologist would be studying the ancient Egyptians, and an archaeologist would study ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Greece, ancient Rome. The artifacts are far more abundant than what we would find in paleoanthropology. And a significant reason for that is because paleoanthropology, and again, I mentioned this earlier, was literally thousands upon thousands, and in some cases tens of thousands of years ago. Well, what has survived and what is easily dug up is far less available for a paleoanthropologist. We don't need that. Far less available for a paleoanthropologist than it would be for an archaeologist. Archaeologists have far greater advantage in the sense that there's far more to find. Archaeology is all about studying chronologies, and what archaeologists have done is they've studied, our use of writing. And for those of you that are taking or have taken ancient civilization, it starts back to the dawn of man. And interestingly enough, when you look at the dawn of humanity, when we first started using tools and when we first started to write and farm and use fire, the invention of the wheel. A lot of people will always assume that it was the Neanderthals that invented the wheel. It wasn't. They had no need for a wheel. In fact, the wheel was not invented for a cart. It wasn't invented for a wheelbarrow. A wheel was first invented for pottery, and it was invented by the Mesopotamians in the ancient world, and the Mesopotamians predated the Egyptians, just to kind of give you an idea of how old this group of people is. Not all how old, but how much older they were than the Egyptians. And the Mesopotamians, in fact, were the ones that invented the wheel, and they started to use the wheel later on for transportation, but initially it was first used for pottery, the pottery wheel. The use of fire, we can kind of stem back even further. Archaeology is also about, not just about dating and this happened first, this happened next, creating a timeline. It's also about understanding where things happened, right? So these were the first guys to use the wheel, and these guys were the first to farm, and these guys were the first to use irrigation. These were the first guys to settle by a river and dig channels from the river into their fields. These were the first people to, draw water from the rivers and carry it to their fields to water their crops. These were the first people to domesticate the goat. That's what archaeology is all about. It's all about understanding who was first, and it's not because they want to give trophies out, because that doesn't really matter. Nobody ever did stuff to say, hey, we used the wheel first, yay, look at us, we're awesome. No, it's all about how did this start, and then how did it spread out, right? I mean, we take it as a common thing where you're like, yeah, you stick a seed in the ground and it grows, you water it, but somebody had to think that up, right? There once upon a time there was the Steve Jobs out there who was like, if I take a seed and plant it, put a little bit of water on it, see what happens, right? People are like, oh, you crazy, right? It's not going to happen. But he did it, and people are like, wow, you're a genius, you're like the Einstein of our age. I stop and think to myself, like, who was the first person who saw a cow in the middle of a field and went, I'm going to milk that and drink it, right? Somebody had to be the first, and that person was a pioneer. They were cutting edge. Think about that, right? Think about this kind of thing. We take it for granted, but somebody had to do it first. The other part is the evolution. How do we start off from having small tribes who had a chief to suddenly great civilizations who have a president, and everything in between? You've got kings, you have emperors, and so forth. And how is it that some societies have completely vanished off the face of the earth, yet at one point in history they were thriving and above and beyond everyone else, and yet they were at some point were wiped out? What happened? So archaeology is all about finding the evidence of not only the rise of civilizations, but the demise of civilizations. Again, prehistory in archaeology is all about before. Oh, by the way, just to kind of clarify something, history is anything that has to do with written. So any kind of history that has any kind of documentation to it, it becomes history. Anything that has no documentation to it whatsoever, written or otherwise, would be considered prehistory. So the difference between prehistoric and historic periods are all about the story, and that's where the historic comes in. In prehistory, there was nothing written or documented. In history, things were written and documented. Prehistoric period is beyond 6,000 years ago. So anything earlier than 6,000 years ago to 2.5 million years ago, but then again, you got to be careful with 2.5 million years ago, because that really is such a long time, and so it's very difficult to classify. When was prehistory? Was it exactly 2.5 million years ago? I don't know. I don't think anybody really could, honestly stand up and go absolutely 2.5 million years ago. But, give or take 2.5 million years ago, assuming that we were here. And then history is going from, 6,000 years ago and on. And again, I mentioned before, it's when you start writing things down. The documentation of history is what determines history and prehistory. Another branch of anthropology, I know, I'm sorry, we're into like a 45-minute lecture already, and there's quite a bit here, but we're getting there. I promise you, we're almost done. You can see here, we're at 28 of 39. There's another 11 slides, but we're there. I promise. I'll speed up. Linguistic anthropology is all about language, and what's very interesting is language is all about communication. You can tell a great deal about different cultures and different groups of people around the world based on their ability to communicate. Now I'm going to kind of throw in something a little bit funny for you here. I'm Greek. That's hilarious, but that's not the funny part. The funny part is that if you know anything about Greeks, we're very loud. Now I'm not being loud here because I'm doing this lecture and it's 11:30 at night, and I got to keep things down because my kids are sleeping finally. But Greeks are loud. So as a kid, my friends would come over and my parents and my grandparents would be talking to each other, but they would be yelling, right? And kids would be like, "Oh, why are your parents fighting? And why is your grandma yelling? Why is she arguing with everybody?" Like, she's not. That's just how they talk. They're loud. That's how we talk. We're all very loud. They're like, "Oh, because they're not fighting, because they're yelling at each other in Greek, right?" But that's how they communicate. There's not that they're fighting. That's just being loud. And there are other cultures that are loud, and that's just how they are. If you don't understand language, you think that they were telling each other off, when in actual fact, like, "Hey, what do you want for dinner? I don't know, whatever you want, cool," right? But it turns into, what would be a normal conversation between two people. If you don't understand the language, turns into, yelling, fighting, screaming. Body language and gestures, other parts. Some people are very animated when they speak. They speak a lot with their hands. Their hands move around when they talk. Other people are visual in their communication and how they write. There are certain cultures around the world that value calligraphy, and that's a form of communication. That's a type of writing, and that's a very significant part of certain cultures. Art is a significant part of certain cultures. People who've traveled to different parts of the world will know that art is very valuable in expression for certain groups and certain cultures throughout the world, throughout history. Linguistic anthropology also has a connection to primates. Now, primatologists like Jane Goodall have studied primates and gorillas, and primatologist by the name of Diane Fossey was very much a student, or not a student, but she studied mountain gorillas. And the thing is that there are significant parts of nonverbal and verbal communication. When I say verbal, I mean it's not like they would say hi, but they would grunt and they would use different vocal tones to communicate with each other. And what's really amazing is that the most subtle communications among them were nothing that seemed like nothing more than grunts and growls. But to the primates themselves, those grunts and growls spoke volumes. They could have conveyed countless ideas. Eventually, somebody came up with the idea, of primatologist and linguistic anthropologist came up with the idea of trying to teach primates sign language. Because if we could teach them sign language, then they no longer have to be able to speak to us, because they can anyway. We don't have to try to translate grunts. We could get them to use their hands, which they have, to communicate with us. And you see here that they've been able to teach some primates to communicate at a 3-year-old level. Now, that's not deeply insightful, but it is a breakthrough. There's a great documentary out there called Project NIM, N-I-M, where these primatologists basically took this baby chimpanzee and tried to raise it as an infant child. So these people, not these people, but primatologists took in to their family a baby chimpanzee and tried to raise it. And there's a whole story that goes with it. It's a documentary. It's called Project NIM. I'm not going to say to you, you have to watch it. But if you do have some time and you can access it, check it out. It's really, really fascinating to see the early development of this, of NIM. That's the name of the chimpanzee, and how NIM develops, and how he starts off as very similar to a human child, but you start to see the development, and the chimpanzee start to kind of override its human, what's the word I'm looking for? It's just getting pretty late, and vocabulary is limited right now. It's human training. That's, I guess, the best way I can say it, and because it's the only chimpanzee surrounded by people. Interestingly enough, if you examine human language, you'll note the following. One, it's extremely fast. Now, certain languages are very quick, and if you don't speak any other language than English, and you hear someone else speaking a language, it sounds like blah, 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 and you're like, I have no idea what you said. For people who speak 2 or more languages, you'll note that you can think about each language differently, and you can understand that each language, separately from the other one, is very unique and it's very quick. And the more proficient you are in a language, the quicker it is. and you can communicate very quickly and share a great deal of information at a high speed. Um, it's also very dense. Human language, all languages, are very complex, and the idea that you can communicate a vast amount of information in very few words, that's the density of it all, right? And it really is fascinating when you consider some of the information that you can convey. Now think about this lecture, right? It's gone for 50 minutes, but I've conveyed to you a significant amount of information, and that's the density of the information and the speed of the information. There's also the subtlety of information, the idea of giving multiple meanings, and me kind of passing along the story of growing up in a Greek family where the parents yelled, and you start to see in your own experiences, maybe you have Greek friends, maybe you're Greek, or maybe your language and your culture is similar, where you're like, oh yeah, people are yelling in my house all the time, and they're not really fighting, it's just because they're really loud. You start to see, and so even though that story might have been very short and relatively subtle, the use of metaphor and the idea that connects to you suddenly has created a whole new meaning, and it really wasn't more than just an anecdote or a story. And so that's the conveyance of so much more meaning in a very simple and quick anecdote. Here's a linguistic challenge, and I've done this with my class. I do it in my lectures live, I guess you can call it, in class, where I'll literally have people, read, right? And the idea is that you read the words. So you start with purple, green, gray, red, white, orange, yellow, right? And so then as people are going through, you're like, what color is this, right? And people go white. I go, no, what color is it, right? And people go purple, right? And you go, okay, let's try this again. What does this say? And people go pink, right? And what is this color? And people go gray, right? And it's funny because people will catch on, right? But early on, you really have to think, right? You see the color, but you have to read the word. And that's all part of the linguistic challenge, is that though you see something, what you're reading is something different. And that's the intricacy of linguistics, and that's one of the things that linguists study, right? And it's because you see one thing, you think something else. Anyone who's studying a different language, for example, people who are studying French or people who study other languages, are often told, think in the language that you're speaking in. If you try to think in one language, translate in your head, and spit it out in another language, it doesn't sound right. And so linguistics is a significant part of being able to truly understand a language and understand what its meanings are beyond what you're translating. So, if we all could use Google Translate, we would all be proficient in all languages, but it's just not that easy. Gesture and body language, again, is very fascinating. And if you consider the next step, okay, yeah, you're going to read this, and I know you will. Gesture is not a word. A gesture is how you behave. Gesture is the tone. Gesture is, is the facial expression that comes with it. But that's just one aspect of it. Think of how gesture has changed now with a new form of communication, which is texting. And people use emojis because you have to almost add that level of communication when you're texting someone. And people use emojis all the time. And what are they? They're gestures, right? I mean, when you text in capitals, people say that means you're yelling. Okay, well, sure, I guess you could call it that. But if you're like gesturing in capitals and then you put like a smiley face emoji, what does that mean, right? That's a new subtlety in gesture. That's a new type of body language, and it's not even physical anymore. Now it's become digital. And so that's a new aspect of linguistic anthropology that linguistic anthropologists are really starting to examine, because it's changing how we communicate and therefore changing how we behave. Cultural anthropology is very unique in the sense that it is a study of living societies. Now, I mean that in the most literal way. Culture is alive. Culture is around you. Culture is everywhere. Culture is, if you were a fish, the water that you swim in. You know it's here. You know you're surrounded by it. You know it's everywhere. But if I was to tell you to point to it, you'd have a really hard time. And so, like I said, if you're a fish, you are swimming in culture. You're surrounded by it. It's everywhere. what's amazing is that we can identify cultures around the world and we can point out unique things about other cultures, but it's very, very difficult to point out your own cultural things, whatever the things are. But cultural anthropologists are all about trying to be impartial third parties. So they kind of step back and examine cultures and study their similarities and study their differences, and very rarely do they judge. That's one thing that cultural anthropologists try not to do. They try not to judge. They simply try to understand. And trying to take your own bias out becomes very, very difficult, because you have a belief. Everyone has a belief that their own culture is unique and better than other cultures. It's just a thing. Now, that's not to say that it's right or wrong. It's just simply everyone feels that way, whether it's right or wrong. But cultural anthropologists try not to be biased, though there's always an aspect of bias. They try to minimize it. Defining culture, I mentioned this before, it encompasses everything from attitudes towards things, philosophical ideas, religious concepts. It could be any one of many things. It's not just a matter of the hat you wear or the food you eat or the shoes that you have, the music you listen to, the dances you do. There's so much more. Culture is, like I said, you're immersed in it, you're surrounded by it, and sometimes you don't even know that certain things that you do are unique to your culture. Here's what's really fascinating about it is it's not genetic, it's learned. Every generation has, though, a very distinct culture from, passed on from the previous generation. It also starts to evolve and adapt and transform it to become its own unique, new, and different culture. And again, it's all a matter of language. It's a matter of when I say language, the language is fundamentally the same, but the slang that's used, the terminology that's used, it's passed on and it's kind of adapted and transformed and is carried forward. There are the fundamentals of a culture that tend to stay the same, but there's also the new adaptations that kind of follow. And so that's why cultural anthropology is all about the living societies, the dead societies and the ones that existed in the past. Yes, they might have an influence, but generally they're gone and you can't really study them because they're not here. Culture is shared among the population, and though there is a variation within it, it generally is kind of the same. Now, it's very difficult to understand from an outsider's perspective the variations within a culture. Now, many of you can attest to this, and I'll try to draw a comparison for almost everyone to understand. Canadians, okay, so to be a Canadian and Canadian culture, whatever you may define it as, you'll say, well, all Canadians are the same. And Canadians will say, well, yeah, but no, right? People from Ontario are definitely different from people from Quebec, and people from BC are different from people from Ontario and different from Quebec. Yes, culture is shared, and culture is kind of homogeneous amongst an entire population, Canada, but there are certain variations within that culture that are distinct and unique. And to an outsider, a culture seems exactly the same. So someone living, for example, in Austria will look at Canada and go, all Canadians are the same. And Canadians will say, no, no, we're so different. Like the people from Burlington are way different from people from Hamilton. Not really, but there are variations, right? And so you'll see that there are discrepancies within. And it's amazing until you actually immerse yourself in a culture and truly examine it from within, you don't see those variations. Almost there, gang, I promise. Cultural anthropology is all about studying symbols. And what's really interesting is that there's a significant symbolic contribution within certain societies. Things that matter to certain groups may not matter to other groups. Certain cultures fixate on certain symbols and certain ideas and certain concepts. Others wouldn't even consider those symbols and ideas. But these symbols are transferable from one generation to the next, and they're often carried forward and sometimes transformed. What do I mean? It's very difficult. I can give you examples, but what I basically I'm going to tell you is that it's all really about what's valuable. Let me try to kind of give you an explanation for this. Okay, so what's valuable to one group of people may not be considered completely valuable to someone else. I'll simplify it. Water. Okay, water. Is water valuable? Sure it is. I'll give you an example of back in the day. I was in university, and this was many, many years ago. And I was studying human anatomy and physiology. And my professor at the time was a doctor from Kenya. And he was amazing. This was like an upper year class, so there was like maybe, and if you know anything about university, you go to upper year classes and upper year courses, and when you get into like third and fourth year, your classes start off like in first year of like you're one of like 200 students in a class, and then when you get to the upper year courses, you're like one of, sometimes it could be as small as like 10 students in a class. So you get to know your profs pretty well. My class was kind of big, so it had like maybe 26 kids or 27 kids, give or take. And so we were sitting in like one of the smaller lecture rooms, and the prof would come in, and he didn't want us to call him a doctor or professor. He wanted us to call him by his first name. And so his name is, I guess he's still around today, his name is Matthews. Matthews, so it's Matthew with an S. African from Kenya, very, very happy man. I never met anyone who smiled as much as Matthews smiled. And so he got to know us all by name. And Matthews had a very, very unique African, I'm going to call it like a Kenyan accent, I guess you could call it that. But he studied in Britain. He studied medicine in Britain. And so he had a very Kenyan British accent. And so one day we're sitting in class waiting as the lecture begins, and Matthews came in and he walked into the class. We're all sitting waiting, good morning. He's like, good morning everybody, right? And we're like, good morning Matthews. I'm not doing justice to his accent. I wish I could. I loved listening to this man talk. He just had the best accent. It was awesome. Anyway, so he came in and he's kind of smiling at us, and he puts his books down and he's looking at us and he's smiling. And he's smiling and just looking at everyone, just kind of making eye contact with everyone. He's good morning, good morning. Look at someone else, good morning. And then he would look at someone else and good morning. Still smiling ear to ear. And then he'd say, you are all very funny people. You are funny. You make me laugh. And we're like, why Matthews? Why? What's so funny? Why? I don't get it. We're kind of like, oh, you're a funny guy. What is it? He goes, you all are drinking bottled water. Is very funny to me, right? And we're like, why? What's that funny? He goes, you will spend money on buying water and putting it in a bottle, but you will not drink water out of your tap. And we were like, yeah, why is that funny? He goes, where I come from, he would say that water is scarce, and if we could drink water out of our taps, we would. We couldn't even imagine having to go out and buy water. You have an abundance of water, and you will go out and spend money, even though you have free water in your homes. So strange. You are funny people. And it really, really made me think. And to this day, that story still resonates with me, because it's a matter of a meaning. And that's what it comes down to, a meaning. The meaning of something as simple as water. If you look at someone who's walking past you and they're carrying a bottle of water, you'll look at and read the label, and you'll say to yourself, oh, are they drinking, water that came from Costco? Are they drinking Evian? Are they drinking Perrier? Are they drinking Dasani? Are they drinking Nestle? What kind of water are they drinking, and why? And it's almost strange that there's a meaning attached to it. Let me change it even further. Someone drinking coffee. Is someone drinking coffee with a Tim Hortons cup, or out of a Starbucks cup, or out of a second cup? That didn't sound right. But is there a meaning that the culture has attached to it? Well, someone who's drinking Starbucks every day probably has a lot of money. Someone who's drinking Tim Hortons every day probably doesn't have a lot of money. Now, that's not necessarily true, but it's a symbolic representation within a culture that we read, that we create an understanding of. And if you were to say to someone like my parents, for example, or a generation in the past, like people are spending $7, $8 for a coffee, they'd be like, "You're crazy. What kind of an idiot would spend $8 for a coffee?" And you're like, "This idiot, me, right?" And they're like, "What? You can just make coffee at home and drink." That's the same culture. One generation separated. Completely different symbolic understanding of the same thing, coffee. I hope that made sense to everybody. Culture is also found in things like clothes and objects and pottery and other stuff like that. And these are material aspects of culture. And they're not necessarily, some are stereotypical, some are less stereotypical. But for the most part, there are certain aspects of culture that you can't really escape. They're material objects that are associated with all kinds of cultures all over the world, and some are unique to some cultures, and there are countless reasons as to why, and we'll discover that and examine that a little bit later on. Okay, so that's that. Wow, 1 hour lecture. I'm so sorry it took this long. Feel free to fly through it at your pace and leisure. Go through the Prezi. I'll post a link. Yeah, go through it. Other stuff will be coming up as the module progresses. My plan is to spend about 3 weeks on this module, so there'll be quite a bit of information coming at you over the next little while. Try to keep up. Let me know if you have any questions, and good luck with everything. We'll talk soon.